Hi guys, welcome back. I am Ginny and this is the big sew along, and in case you can't tell, it is positively freezing here today. So although I am wearing my really cute daisy tunic dress that I made back in the fall, you can't see it because I'm freezing. But I wanted to tell you guys, I just heard from the designer who made this daisy tunic dress. I believe she is coming out with a couple of new patterns sometime soon. I haven't seen pictures of them yet, but I really like her things and I'm very excited to see what she comes up with next. She did just come out with a new pant pattern, I want to say right near the first of the year. It could have been right before the first of the year. Anyways, her shop is called Aura Atelier, and I will leave a link to that down below. I don't know when her new patterns will be out, but I assume sometime soon. So just keep an eye on her shop. Her designs are very cool. Also, Opal Annie, who we featured last month here, is also coming out with a couple of new patterns. Probably this month. I don't know for sure, but it sounds like they'll be out pretty soon. Hers are a pair of pants and a jacket. They both look really cool. So if you haven't already earmarked her Etsy shop, you should do that so you can see when they come out. And I will link her shop below as well. Today, we are working on our Clair de Lune hoodie from Bmann by Bridget. That one. Let's get some of the details out of the way here. This pattern, the sizing on this goes from a bust size of 40 inches to 49 inches, which is equivalent to roughly 101.6 centimeters to 121 centimeters. That is the bust and the hip measurement in this because it's cut straight. This pattern has a front piece, a back piece. The sleeves are part of the front and part of the back, so there is a center seam that goes down the center of the sleeve. These sleeves, however, unlike some where that sleeve seam is straight, these sleeves actually have a little bit of a curve in them, which in my opinion makes the sleeve lay really nicely when you have it on. Okay, so there's also a hood, obviously, and there are options for cuff bands and a hemband. There's also an option and directions for cutting the bottom half off and reattaching, so if you wanted to use like different fabrics or something like that. I will say, I think her directions are pretty good, and I accidentally printed this whole thing, which was stupid because you don't really need to. A lot of them are like photographs. So her pattern has a lot of photos in it, which makes it really easy to follow along. She also does have some drawn diagrams, and that's also very helpful. So, what was I gonna say? The way we did this week, I made two. I started with the first one that I made. I'll put a picture up here. This one I made in the heavyweight linen from fabricstore.com, and I used like some leftover silk organza for my cuff bands and my hemband, and I also used that same organza to do a Hong Kong finish on my hood. Now for today, she gives you directions for making the hood without a lining and also with a lining. Without a lining, your hood seam is obviously going to show. So you need to be aware of that so that you can finish that in a way that's satisfactory to you. I decided to do that today, to do unlined and do Hong Kong finishes on my seam, on the hood seams, because I think that looks really nice, and also then when you have it, when you can see inside the hood, the Hong Kong finish, the trim, the bias trim used for the Hong Kong finish, looks like stripes, and you'll see in the tutorial here in a minute. And I really like that. I thought it looked really cool. I wanted to say that if you like that idea, you could also do the exact same thing on the sleeves, and that would make that center sleeve seam a detail. It would look like you had a stripe running down it, which could be really cool. I think the second one I made of these, and I'll show you that you'll see this one that we, during the tutorial, the second one I made out of a lighter weight linen from my local fabric shop, and also I used some trim that was left over from a vintage sheet, and I thought that came out really cute too. I don't think that I have much else to say about this. This is not a hard make at all. It's pretty easy. I will say, if you haven't done a Hong Kong finish before, but you have some experience, you should try it. It looks really nice, particularly in this pattern. If you're less experienced and you're not up for that, then you can just follow her regular directions for finishing it with either a zigzag or a serged seam in the center of the hood, or just line it. Lining it is really easy, and she gives you good directions for that, so that's an option as well. I think that's it. We'll go to the tutorial now. We'll walk you through making the whole hoodie, and then we'll come back. So the pieces we'll have so far are all together, actually. We'll have one back piece. We will have one front piece. You'll notice that the neckline is obviously different on that. We'll have one hood. Well, there are actually two hood pieces for your hood. And then you're going to make some bands for the bottom. You need 4 inches by the width, by the circumference of your cuff. So 4 inches wide, the length of the circumference of your cuff plus a seam allowance for the cuff. For the bottom band, it's going to be the circumference of the bottom by 4 inches, and again, you're going to need a seam allowance. My bands are not wide enough to go, long enough to go all the way around, so I'm going to cut 2 and put 2 side seams in. So I'll need some seam allowances on both sides of those. Okay. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our hood piece, and we're just going to sew it along this outer edge from here around this way to here at 3/8 of an inch seam, with a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now, if you're lining yours, you're going to want to do the exact same thing to the lining before you go any further. For this one, we're not lining it, so we're just going to sew this, and then we're going to come back. This is what our hood looks like with that seam sewn. You can see I've pressed mine open. Now, you can finish the seam allowance any way you like. I thought, because this hood, the inside of your hood shows, if you're not lining it, I thought it would be nice to make this seam a feature. So I'm going to Hong Kong finish this, and I will show you how I do that. I'm going to fold it out like this, so I'm just working with the seam allowance and not the actual hood. And I have 1-inch pieces of bias tape here, and I am going to stitch, I'm going to pin one right along the edge of one side of my seam allowance. Now, our seam allowances here are only 3/8 of an inch, so we're going to have to be really careful sewing this on. It might have been wise for us to cut this hood with a wider seam allowance. But since we didn't, we're going to see if we can get this to work. We're going to pin this all the way around just like this. And you can see here, I'm just pinning it to one side of my seam allowance. Everything else is free. Then we're going to go back to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew this on with I'm going to say 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we should have something that looks like this. This is our seam allowance pressed open, and this is our bias tape sewn on and pressed outwards so it's nice and flat. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to fold this bias tape over to the back side like that. And then we're going to stitch in the ditch right here along this seam line where we sewed that bias tape on. And we're going to do that all the way down. And then we're going to do that exact same process on this seam allowance. Now our hood should look like this. It's got a binding on each part of the sides of the seam. And that is the inside of our hood. But we're not finished. So, if you go back to these seams, and you will see on the back side, you probably have, if you used 1 inch bias binding and used a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this, you are going to have extra here. So we're just going to very carefully trim that off. And you can trim really as close to the stitching here as you can get. Just be really careful not to cut your hood or the bias trim off the side over here where we're trimming next to. So it should look really nice and clean like that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to the ironing board and we're going to press this open again so that this whole seam is laying really flat, just like that. And then we're going to edge stitch this down on both sides. So right along here, all the way down, and right along here, all the way down. This is what our hood looks like so far. This is the outside, and you can see my stitching there. And then the inside looks like that. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to take a longer piece of bias tape, and I folded, it's 1 inch wide again. I folded one side under 1/4 inch. The other side we are going to attach to the entire length of our hood, the outer edge, on the outside of the hood. So we're just going to pin it all the way around, and then we're going to stitch it down again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You can see that I've gone ahead and bound the outside edge of my hood here. I sewed my bias binding to the outside of my hood and pressed it over to the inside, just like we did before, and I sewed it down. Now I don't need to trim this down this time because we want to fold this in towards the inside of the hood 1/2 inch. So it will be right about there. There. I'm gonna press the whole thing under 1/2 inch all the way around, and then I'm gonna edge stitch that down along this edge just like we did on our bias binding for the seam. And that is our hood finished and looking pretty darn nice. Alright, we're just going to put that aside for a moment. We're going to grab the front and the back. That is our front. This is the right side. This is our back. They're right sides together. We're going to pin our shoulder seams and sleeve seams from here to here, from here to here, so that, and then we're going to do the same thing on the side seams from here to here. We're going to do that on the other side as well. We're going to finish all of those seams. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 seams, and press them all towards the back. I forgot to mention before, you guys, this top shoulder seam here is not a straight line. It's got a little bit of a curve in it. So just be careful when you're, that actually makes it lay really nicely when you're wearing it. but just be careful when you're sewing it, because that does mean it has a little bit of bias in there and it can pull out of shape really easily. The other thing is, after you're done sewing this underarm seam here, you're going to need to clip this almost like a little corner here. You're going to need to clip into that corner. Just one good clip right to the point is good, just so it will lay flat when you press it right side out like this. Now, if you're following the directions, the next thing they say to do is put the hoodie on, but I am going to put my hoodie on last because I don't like to have it flopping around while I'm trying to do other stuff. It's just an excuse for me to get it caught in something. So what we're going to do next is our, if you haven't done it already, stay stitch your neckline for now so we don't get that pulled out of place. We're going to do the bottom band, and then I'm not going to show you the sleeve bands because they're exactly the same. You're going to apply them the same way. But this is what we're going to do. You're going to take your bottom band. Mine is a lot wider than the one that she suggests in the pattern, and that's just because I have this large border print that I didn't want to cut apart. So I shortened my top to allow for that. You are going to turn your hemband into a tube like this, and then you're going to fold it wrong sides together and press it so it looks like that, so it's in half. And then all we're going to do is put that on the right side of our shirt. We're going to pin this in place. Now we're going to go over to the sewing machine and sew this on with our 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to press it up towards the top of the shirt. Here we have our whole hoodie put together. I sewed my bands on and then folded them up towards the shirt. I finished that seam, and then I just top stitched that seam down so that that little seam allowance doesn't flip over to the inside. I did the exact same thing on the sleeves. Now we just need to make our hood, but you know what, before I go any further, it says in the instructions, but just be aware that if you're adding this band to the bottom, you're going to want to check the length of your top and the length of your sleeves before you put those on, because you may need to shorten them depending on how tall you are or how long you want those to be. I shortened both of mine considerably because I was using a much wider band. My band is almost 5 inches, and the one that she recommends in the pattern is only 2. So if you're using that, you may not be that big of a deal, but check it anyway. Okay, so next up is our hood, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to turn our top inside out. Now we're just going to pin our hood into our neck hole. That is the center back of my neck. And we're going to place right sides together. So this is, my top is inside out, so the right side is on the inside. The right side of your hood is this side, the side that you can't see the seam on. This one where we bound, that's the wrong side, so that should be facing up. Just start with one pin at the center back, and then remember there's a little bit of the bias to this cut line on both the hood and on your shirt, so try not to pull it too much. You're just going to pin it all the way around. And you can see the curve of the hood really matches the curve of the neckline pretty well. Now your hood is not going to come, the front edge of your hood is not going to come all the way to the center of your shirt. That's fine. Just be sure it's even all the way around. Now we're going to do the other side. Okay, so before we go any further, let's stick our hood inside, all the way inside our top, and just make sure this is the center front of my shirt right here. This side of my hood, you can see, is closer than this side. That just means that one side has been stretched a little more. So now you just need to make a decision. Do I want to stretch this side more to come closer, or do I want to rework this side so that it comes a little further out? For me, I think it's going to be this way. And I'm just going to take these out, a few pins. You just want to be sure that edges, these two edges are equidistant from that center. And like I said, both of these raw edges have a lot of bias in them, so it's going to be easy for one of them to get stretched out more than the other. So just double check before you sew anything on. Now I've repinned this side, so now these edges are both yeah, they're both about 5/8 of an inch away from the center now. Whatever it is, it doesn't have to be 5/8 of an inch. Yours might be 7/8 of an inch, or it might be 5/8 of an inch. Just make sure that it's even on both sides. Now we're just going to go to the sewing machine and baste this in. There we have our hood basted in. Our shirt is still wrong side out. Now we're going to take our bias tape to cover this seam. And we're going to do almost exactly the same thing we did when we were binding the seams on the inside of our hood here. We're going to lay this along our bias tape along this edge. Actually, I'm going to start at the center front. And we're just going to pin it all the way around. I'm going to put one pin in my bias tape right here at the center back. And then I'm going to go back to the other side and pin the other side down. Now, like I always do, when I get to the center back here, I'm going to put another pin in this side, so it's right at the center back. And I'm going to hold both of these pieces together. These are my excess bias tape. And I'm going to cut them off with, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Roughly. That's right about there. Now, I'm going to take this back to the sewing machine. I'm going to unpin that. I'm going to sew these two short ends together with my seam allowance, whatever I just cut. Then I'm going to put it all back inside here. And we're going to baste this tape all the way around. No, sorry. No, we're not going to baste it. We're going to just sew it all the way around. Now we have our seam binding attached all the way around our neck. And this is a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you have a 1 inch piece of bias tape here. So according to the directions, we're going to fold this over like this, press it, and then fold it over to the back side. Then we're going to fold that down to the inside and stitch it down. And that is perfectly fine. I like to stitch in the ditch on my bindings to keep them from moving around when I sew them down to the main garment. And I don't have enough fabric to do that with this 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I am going to trim mine down. I prefer this seam allowance when it's finished to be closer to 1/4 of an inch, which is obviously not that much to trim off. I'm going to trim off about half of this. Now we have our bias tape sewn in here like this, and I like to fold this over, just over the seam, like that, and then stitch in the ditch here. And then once that's done, you press the whole thing to the inside and stitch it down. Now you don't have to do the stitch in the ditch. When you're sewing this down like this, I did that backwards. When you're sewing this down like this, sometimes this back side of your bias tape will slide out and make that uneven. That is why I do the stitch in the ditch. But if you're not worried about that, you don't have to do the stitch in the ditch. You can just fold this over to the back side and press it like that, and then fold that to the inside right along that seam line and edge stitch it down. The edge stitching is going to keep it all in place. The only reason I do the stitch in the ditch is so that this edge of the binding doesn't move while I'm sewing it down. I hope that makes sense. So whether you've done a stitch in the ditch on your binding or if you've just folded it over to the back side, it doesn't matter. We're all going to go the same direction from here. This is the inside of our hoodie, and this is the binding that we've just put on. We're just going to press that down into the inside, towards the inside of our hoodie, of our shirt part. Wow, could that be any more convoluted? So it looks like that on the outside and that on the inside. I would like that to be more like that. Then we're just going to put some pins right around the edge here, and we are going to edge stitch this bias tape down just like we did right here and right here. And that is the very last step in your Clair de Lune hoodie. Just be careful. You have a hood and some sleeves and stuff. Just be sure when you're sewing this down that you're not catching anything else. You just want the front of your shirt and your bias trim. Okay. I forgot to tell you when we were talking about this pattern originally, but it is a PDF pattern. If you don't do what I did and print the whole entire thing, which is you just don't need to do, if you're just printing the pattern itself, it's 16 pages, so not a lot to print out, and it goes together really quickly and really well. I do really like this hoodie. I wanted desperately to make this in velvet, and I just don't have any, and I'm gonna order some, but I didn't have time to get it here in time for this video, so I made 2 of them in linen. And I'll show you my second one again here. I really like this pattern. There's a ton of room for, again, for doing all kinds of embellishments with your cut lines and with your banding and the lining and the hood. I mean, you have a lot of places where you can play with your fabrics. It's a really easy pattern for fitting because it's completely straight up and down in the body, so you don't have any big fitting things. It has a nice slightly curved shoulder line, so it shouldn't be a big issue if you happen to have really narrow shoulders, or even if you have broader shoulders, you probably are going to be fine. Yeah, I had no problems with this pattern, and it was really fun to make, and I will definitely be making it again in velvet as soon as I can get a hold of some that I really like. And you guys, I think that is it. Again, this pattern is Bmann by Bridget, and the pattern name is Clair de Lune. I will link all of that down below for you. Next week, we are going to be sewing Bmann by Bridget's Les Etoiles pattern, and I'm really excited for that one. I'm not sure what fabric I'm going to use yet. I do still have a hunk of fabric from Diamond Textiles, and I'm really thinking about using that. So I guess we'll wait and see. Alright guys, thank you so much again for stopping by. Happy sewing, and I will see you next week.